All right. Can everyone see my title slide? Awesome. Thank you. So to kick us off, I just want to clarify, I know we only have 20 minutes, so I tried to keep it brief. I have two goals. Number one, I'm hoping by the end of this, we will all feel compelled to look at our data and we'll learn more about how we perceive visual information. And then number two, I want to talk through 5 guidelines for how you can create better data visualizations to share your findings with others so that you'll create memorable plots and graphs. So to start out, I'd like to share an example that would come up during the analysis phase. So these are 4 data sets that each contain 2 variables, an X and a Y. And by looking at the data, you can tell that each of the 4 data sets has an X variable that is comprised of integers, and the Y variable are all continuous. And you could maybe look at it a little longer and say, oh gosh, for the first 3 data sets, all the X variables are the same, but not for the 4th data set. But that's really where it stops. I mean, maybe you could keep staring and eventually you might say, oh, that 19 in the 4th data set seems like it could be an outlier, but how can you really know? And it's also really difficult to draw any conclusions about the nature of the relationship between the X and the Y variables. And it's almost impossible to draw any conclusions across each of these 4 data sets. So where I would naturally start is with some summary statistics to help me understand the relationship between these 2 variables. And if you did that with these 4 data sets, you would learn that they all have the same sample means, they have the same sample variances, the X and the Y has the same correlation in each of these 4 data sets, and they even have the same linear regression line of best fit. They have the same slope. So a conclusion you could draw from that might be that the relationship between X and Y is the same in all 4 of these data sets. But if you stopped there, you would be dead wrong. Because if you look at your data, you would tell immediately that the relationship between X and Y is totally different across each of these 4 data sets, where the first one does look pretty linear, but 2 is obviously a nonlinear relationship. And 3 and 4 have both some terrible outliers that are affecting the lines of best fit, even though they do have the same linear regression line. So these 4 data sets are a part of a classic example called Anscombe's quartet. They were developed by Francis Anscombe back in the 70s to serve as a cautionary tale to not trust a mean. You always want to look at your data and see if there's anything quirky or unexpected going on in your data set. So first, I'd like to talk about how we perceive visual information when we've plotted it. How do we tell things are grouped together? So first, we can use proximity to tell that things that are closer together are more likely to be a part of a group. We can use color or shape or direction to discern groups, where in this case, color has been used to differentiate the green group from the yellow group. You can use enclosure, where bounded objects are more likely to be a part of the same group. And lastly, you can use connection, where connected objects are more likely to be a part of the same group. These are part of what are known as pre-attentive processing attributes. So these are visual triggers that unconsciously help your readers understand connections in your results or arrive at your take-home conclusion. So they are cognitive operations that can be performed prior to focusing your attention on any particular region of an image. So here I have a classic image from the Where's Waldo series. And obviously there are no pre-attentive processing attributes at play here. Everything is a mess. It's going to take forever to find him, as you all know, but we can easily help make sense of this by capitalizing on color and position to make Waldo pop so that it is immediately obvious where he is. So there are several different types of pre-attentive processing attributes that you can use as visual cues to draw your reader's eye and make it easy for them to arrive at your take-home conclusion. And the other thing that's really great about the visual is that it's more likely to stick with the person after they leave. So you're at your poster presentation, you've worked really hard, and people are passing by, and yes, they might remember what they've read, but they're definitely going to remember what they saw. So just like you all, I'm sure later on in the week when you're talking with your colleagues and you're like, oh my gosh, Ivy Lab was so awesome. We talked about these 4 crazy data sets that when they're plotted, they're totally different. And the thing that you're going to picture in your mind is the plots, not the data sets themselves. That's because visuals are compelling. So I wanted to share a couple of plots that I like that are good illustrations of these pre-attentive processing attributes. So first, this is an example of the relationship between school district wealth, which is on the x-axis, and student test score, which is on the y. So immediately, it's easy to see that there is a positive association between how rich a school district is and how well the students are doing on their test scores. But there's also a couple of other things that make this plot compelling. So one, they're showing you the data. You can see lots of different points are used to create this plot, but it's not overwhelming because they're using color to make 3 school districts pop. And that's because in the body of the text, they go into details about these 3 school districts. So it was helpful for them to highlight where they fall on this continuum of wealth and test scores to complement their text. They're also using the size of the point to help you also see that there's variation in the size of the school district. So the Chicago school district is much larger than either of the other 2, and that's discussed in the body of the text. The second example is one from RAND, and this was actually from a talk that I went to where the presenter, was presenting some really excellent work, but the thing that stuck with me was this plot. And I reached out to her on Twitter to ask if I could use it in this talk because I thought it was so compelling. So they have summarized over 20 years of state variation in policies related to substance use in pregnancy, both punitive and supportive policies, in 3 really concise plots. So they have used color to differentiate between punitive policies, which are the orange and the brown. So those are things like mandated reporting and testing for substance use in pregnancy. And the greens are the supportive policies, like funded programs that are targeted for pregnant people with substance use disorder, things like that. So using the color in this way, it's pretty easy to tell that there's been a growth of both kinds of policies over the past 2 decades. And there's not really any geographic pattern to it. They're sort of all over the place. But the other thing that I like about this plot is they're using enclosure around each of the census regions to group the states into those regions. So if you notice, the big change in the supportive policies between 2008 and 2015 was here in this East South Central region, where you go from two policies up to a lot of improvement in 2015. So I thought this was a pretty excellent way to organize a lot of really complicated and heterogeneous policy change over time in a way that can help you make sense of it as a researcher and also as a consumer of this as a reader. Okay, the next one is from the Prison Policy Institute, and this is a plot of how the women's prison incarceration rate has changed over the past 100 years. So they're using color to distinguish between two rates and make two different points. So the yellow is the national average. So from that line, it's easy to see that the women's prison incarceration rate really started to spike up in the 80s. That's when this really started. But the other thing that's so compelling about this plot is with the orange lines, where they're also illustrating that there is a lot of state variation that is hidden in that national average. So you can see that Oklahoma has over 6 times the incarceration rate as Maine. So you would not have been able to tell that just by looking at the overall average. So again, means can be deceiving. So now that we've talked through a couple of visual cues for ways that you can draw attention to various things, I thought it might be helpful to go over 5 guidelines that you can use to make it easy for your reader to understand your take-home message. So the first one is to show them the data, right? And so this is an example. It's just a starting point. But if you really want your reader to get the point, buy your argument, and remember the take-home message, remember the story, they need to see the data. And so here, this is less relevant to our collective research interest. This is car sales, quarterly car sales, and it's grouped by car dealership. So you can see there's a whole lot going on. Got a lot of different dealerships here listed in the legend. There's a lot of variation within it. This purple group is all over the place. And buried in here is the regional average. So that can be kind of hard to see. So it's helpful for the second guideline to reduce the clutter in your graph. So here you can see this is the same data on the lower left corner of this graph, but instead of all the colors, they have taken each of the dealerships and made them gray and really focused on the regional average by highlighting that trend in black. And they've also included a different data element, which is the variance, to show that this purple dealership up at the top, they have the highest variance in car sales over the quarter. So maybe if their regional manager wants to engage, they kind of know where to start. But those take-home messages are really almost impossible to pull out of this first graph. So it helps to reduce the clutter. The next point is to integrate your graphics and your text. And this plot is actually from my research team. And this was from a research brief from last year about the impact of the arts benefit in Virginia on utilization of substance use disorder treatment services among Medicaid enrollees in Virginia. So I wanted to show just the absolute explosion in utilization of services across the continuum of care and how that's grown in the first few years of arts. And I used color to distinguish between the ASAM continuum of care, which is at the top in the purplish colors, and I've used saturation to indicate the higher levels of care, the more intense levels of care. And I've used green to distinguish between the supportive services like peer recovery and care coordination. But instead of creating, making a plot and then including your typical legend at the bottom with each of my colors labeled with the setting or the level of care that it's in reference to, I just put the label right on the graph, right next to the setting that it's in reference to, and I labeled it in the same color just to be crystal clear on which level of care is represented in which section. So I wanted it to be clear to the reader that there's been an absolute growth in the use of outpatient treatment services for Medicaid members, which is such a wonderful finding. And then to really drive the message home, I just made the title the key point, which is members using treatment services is up 172%. So I was really pleased with that one. And so was Virginia Medicaid. So the fourth guideline to keep in mind is to avoid the dreaded spaghetti chart. So this is where, going back to the first graph, it looks like spaghetti on a plate. And it doesn't even matter what the details are because it's nearly impossible to pull any insight out of this visual. It's a mess. So I know we've all been in seminars where you see a plot like this and you look at it for a second and then you go, nope, that's okay. You mentally check out because it is not readily apparent to you. And in that moment, you're having to make the choice. Am I looking at the slide or am I listening to the speaker? So that's where you can often shut your audience down from paying attention to your slides if it's presented in a kind of mess like this spaghetti chart. But we can fix it. And the way that this particular chart was fixed was using a technique called a small multiple. So each of these charts is the same set of data, and it's broken out by each category, where again, they've used saturation to make all of the other data points recede into the background, and then use blue to make each individual category pop on its own, so that you can tell easily that there hasn't really been a whole lot of change over time in whatever this budget is, with the exception of category 2, which has increased considerably. So that is a great way to deal with the spaghetti plot. And then lastly, the last tip is to start with gray, which might seem sort of counterintuitive. A lot of compelling data visualizations, really use a lot of color. They might use, some nice enclosures or some nice annotations. But really, when you're getting started on designing your plot, it's nice to strip it down to the bare bones and really think about, how do I want to use color? What do I want to pop for my reader? What do I really want to emphasize so that they'll remember this when they walk away from my poster, or when they leave my talk and they're getting on Twitter to share their thoughts with their friends? What do I want the key take-home message to be? So this point is to start with gray, to remind yourself to be really purposeful with the pre-attentive processing attributes that you use, and to use them very deliberately to really drive that focus to the point that you're trying to drive home. So if y'all are interested in learning more, I have this book right here, actually. My book by John Swabish. He is an economist at the Urban Institute, and he also teaches how to give presentations, how to design data visualizations, and he is excellent at it. And this book came out last year. It's a guide for scholars, researchers, and WOCs. So I think that includes all of us. And I actually won this book by creating the plot that's on the left. So he had a challenge on Twitter and he was going to give away a couple of signed copies for people who could come up with a creative data visualization using household objects. And so I saw this on Twitter on my lunch break, and I thought, what do I have that I could use that's compelling? So I grabbed some sneakers from the closet to illustrate that there's a negative association in my house between the shoe size of the folks who live here and the number of pairs of Jordans that we have. So obviously I have 3 and my sweetheart has 2. And it was good enough to win the book, so I'll take it. But John Swabish is an excellent resource. This book is excellent. I use it all the time. I've loaned it out to several of my colleagues, and I can't recommend it enough. But also, his Twitter is an excellent resource, and Twitter in general for that matter. So there is a hashtag called Tidy Tuesday that is all about designing data visualizations, and you don't have to do it yourself, but you can get inspiration from others, see how other people are redesigning kind of boring plots or maybe spaghetti plots, to see how they are piecing together these guidelines to come up with different options to see what you like and what you don't like. So I think Twitter is great for that. And that's it. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is DataAaron. Lately, I've been tweeting a lot about econometrics and statistics, and less about data viz, but it is still something that I love to chat about. So if any of you are, hitting a wall in your designs for your posters, please feel free to contact me via email or Twitter. I'm happy to chat. I love talking about uses of color, and I have a lot of resources so that you can make sure that your plots are accessible for folks, who maybe are colorblind and things of that nature. So I'm always happy to chat about data viz. That's it. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was excellent. I definitely learned some stuff too. Super helpful. I'm going to start off questions, but I'm assuming others are going to have questions too. But kind of on your last point about the starting with the gray, a lot of journals, when you get to I know we can do color and all the fun things for talks and posters, but when you go to manuscripts, sometimes there's a fee for color, and we're not made out of a whole bunch of money with the Ivy Lab. So we a lot of times opt out of that extra fee in order to have color figures that if it's a printed journal. So do you have any recommendations when we are having to take a figure and only use black and white to make sure that we're letting the data tell a good story?
Yeah, you can do a lot with gray. And actually, I might go back to this image. Let's see. Because there's more I can say on gray. Okay, so the thing that is so cool about gray is that, so this is a grid, a 3x3 grid, and in each column, the bars are the same colors, but you can't really tell the difference unless you're in those similar corners, right? So here you can really tell the difference between the grays, but they're almost indistinguishable here. So really, starting with gray has really made me develop an appreciation for gray in what you can really highlight and distinguish. And then also, I would think about ways, using enclosure. I'm a big fan of annotations. Yeah, I would just play up on the other attributes. Oh, and then also, just because you don't want to pay to publish the color doesn't mean you shouldn't make a color version and post a thread on Twitter. I love new pub alerts where the researcher is giving basically like a cliff notes of a new paper that's come out, and that's where you can really get people's attention with those color plots and really drive up your downloads and citation counts by spreading the word about new papers. and making them compelling with beautiful graphs. So I don't know if anybody else loves those new pub alerts.
That's really helpful. Thank you. What other questions do people have?
Hi, Erin. This is Deshonda. I think this is my second or third presentation I've seen with your data visualization. I love them every time. But my question is, so generally I know we use Excel and PowerPoint a lot. What programs do you use to make the data visualizations that you generally create? Because I don't see the one that you created for the ASAM. I don't see that type on Excel or PowerPoint. So how do you do that?
That is an excellent question. Also, hey, Deshonda, and I'm so glad you're not over me talking about DataViz.
No, I love it.
So actually, I actually made that plot for Medicaid in Excel. So, you know, I love all sorts of tools. You know, we can get really fancy and write code in R, and you know, we can use some default graphs from SAS or Stata, but I think Excel gets a bad rap. PowerPoint gets a bad rap. You can do some pretty cool things with that. And there's lots of really great tutorials on how to put those plots together, how to structure your data set in order to make a plot a certain way. And John Schwadish's website, I think it's policyviz.com. I'll look it up and put it in the chat. But he is also a big believer in Excel and likes to put together tutorials on how to make different plots in Excel. So yeah, there's no wrong tools.
All right, great. That's good to know. I've definitely been trying to improve my PowerPoint, even from the time that I presented for the Ivy Lab. I've been trying to make it more compelling. So, and I've just been using PowerPoint as well. So thank you. And I'll look more into Excel, and I'll try to get that book.
Yeah, and you know, always feel free to contact me if you're, you know, having issues. You want to achieve a certain look and you're not quite sure how to do it. I'm really good at Googling things and figuring it out. So it's a whole skill knowing how to Google things.
Great.
And also another point I wanted to make, and I should have just thrown a slide in there, is maybe it's a sixth guideline, and this is an Erin Britton exclusive. This isn't official, but I like to start analog. So I'm holding a pencil right now, and I have my notebook in front of me because I always start with a paper and pencil to get my ideas going, to really think about, you know, what is it that I really want to sell here? What's going to be my x-axis? What's on the y? How can I use size to emphasize different things? What's the most important thing to highlight with color? I design all of my posters on paper and pencil first. So I really believe in the analog design thinking before you ever touch a computer at all. I think it helps clarify your thinking process.
Anyone else have any more questions for Erin? Just full of so many tips and tricks.
I know, I'm really glad she's here, because one of the questions I had for my project is, how the heck are we going to visualize this? Like, what are we going to do that's meaningful? So I'm going to present my data after the presentation about how to present your data well.
Awesome.
Yeah, and something I would say, Erin, you know, just kind of tying what you're saying back to what a lot of our current projects and the analyses that a lot of the students are working on too. Some of our data sets are smaller data sets. You know, you're working with huge claims data. We have some smaller data sets that we have currently that we're looking at from VCU. And so we have the luxury of looking at individual trajectories, you know, because of these smaller data sets, but trying to look at subgroups in the group as a whole. And so I think what you're saying by, you know, showing the data and it telling a story is, I mean, I feel like I say that all the time to people, like, what is the data showing you? What is the story? you know, for qualitative data, that's easy, right? Qualitative data, we group it into themes and then you give individual quotes, right? Like individual things. And there's no reason why quantitative data can't tell its own type of story, right? By showing us means, groups, etc., and showing us individual trajectories. And in the setting of the research that we do, I mean, the take-home point of every study, every manuscript I ever write is we need to advance evidence-based individualized treatment approaches, right? The key word there is individualized. So I think a lot of what you said, a lot of pointers you brought up work really well with what we do, where we're trying to highlight that you can't take a cookie cutter approach to patient care, right? Because a lot of our stuff is very individual level treatment approaches things. But at the same time, we are trying to see, gosh, like when they're in this system, in this treatment, in this group therapy, whatever it is, this is generally what's happening, but you can't take a cookie cutter approach. So I think what you're saying with how you visualize the data matches with what, from a clinician perspective, clinician researcher, what we say. So I like your approaches because I think they're very applicable to our take-home points from the clinical research side of things.
I love that. It ties right back in with the whole reason I'm involved in research at all. I think policy is really great, but it's always important to remember who it's not necessarily working for so that you can highlight those opportunities for improvement and close those cracks. So I just love it. It's such a joy to be a part of this team. And thank you so much again for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Erin, so much. I appreciate it. And just a couple more things to add, just because I have the floor, is for people who work with me, is a couple things Erin said are things that I ask a lot of people to do too, which is one, before you start your analysis, I always want you to have blank tables, right? And I want you to have you have your research question, your independent variable, dependent variable, how you're measured, how they're being defined, and I always want blank tables. And then, but there's no reason why you can't mock up what your figure is going to look like too. And then for the people who are then translating their findings into poster presentations and manuscripts, there's probably not one person on this call who has not had me say, can you make a figure of that? You know, because I agree with Erin, and I give a lot of talks, right? People ask me to come give talks about substance use and pregnancy and women all the time. And, you know, I give a lot of evidence in my talks for obvious reasons, and papers that have a figure are just so much easier as a clinician who's trying to put together a PowerPoint for a talk. You know, I'm so much more likely to cite your paper in my talk, right? And share that with the lay public and clinicians and the audiences that researchers want to reach. You know, you're at least from my experience, you're much more likely to share your research with the people that you want it to be shared with if you have a figure, because it's easier and it's what people look at and it's what I use. So that's another kind of, if you want some more oomph to take that extra few minutes, because I know it does take a little extra time to make a nice figure, but it's just in the table, isn't that right? Can I just use that? It is worth the extra time to put into the formatting and all that. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Well, thank you again, Erin. That was spectacular. Very, very happy. Appreciate it. Looking forward to making more figures with you.